The origins of the Six-Day War, which was fought between June 5 and June 10, 1967, by Israel and the neighboring states of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, lay in both longer-term and immediate issues. The foundation of Israel linked to the Palestinian refugee problem and its participation in the invasion of Egypt during the Suez Crisis of 1956, continued to be a significant grievance for the Arab world. Arab nationalists, led by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, continued to be hostile to Israel's existence. By the mid-1960s, relations between Israel and its Arab neighbors had deteriorated to the extent that a number of border clashes had taken place. In April 1967, Israel's army and air force attacked Syria in response to Syrian shooting towards an Israeli tractor plowing in the DMZ. In May 1967, Egypt expelled UN peacekeepers stationed in the Sinai Peninsula since the Suez conflict, and announced a partial blockade of Israelis' access to the Red Sea. Israel claimed this as a casus belli. Tension escalated, with both sides' armies mobilizing. Less than a month later, Israel launched a surprise strike which began the Six-Day War. The conventional view in memoirs of key Israelis is that Israel's actions leading into the war were prudent and the blame for the war rested on Egypt. Scholarly studies paint a less one-sided picture. According to these studies, a complicated process of unwanted escalation, which all sides wanted to prevent, but for which all were ultimately responsible, led up to the crisis. On the 23rd of May 1967, Nasser blockaded the Straits of Tiran from Israeli vessel passage, despite knowing it might very likely provide Israel with the trigger it needed to launch a war. Nasser's decisions to ask for the removal of UNEF from Sinai and to block the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli shipping are commonly accepted as the point where war became inevitable. Many commentators consider the war as the classic case of anticipatory attack in self-defense. Summary of events leading to war. After the 1956 Suez Crisis, Egypt agreed to the stationing of a United Nations emergency force in the Sinai to ensure all parties would comply with the 1949 armistice agreements. Despite the overwhelming support for Resolution 1000 in the UN General Assembly, Israel refused to allow UNEF forces onto its territory. In the following years, there were numerous minor border clashes between Israel and its Arab neighbors, particularly Syria. In early November 1966, Syria signed a mutual defense agreement with Egypt. On November 13, 1966, in response to PLO guerrilla activity, including a mine attack that left 3 dead, the Israeli Defense Force attacked the village of Az-Samu in the Jordanian-occupied West Bank. Jordanian units that engaged the Israelis were quickly beaten back. King Hussein of Jordan criticized Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser for failing to come to Jordan's aid, and hiding behind UNEF skirts. Israel was censured for this invasion in United Nations Security Council Resolution 228, being reproached by the US, the UK, France and the USSR. On April 7, 1967, Israel invaded Syria. The USSR urged that the collective defense agreement with Egypt had been triggered. In May 1967, Nasser received false reports from the Soviet Union that Israel was massing on the Syrian border. Nasser began massing his troops in the Sinai Peninsula on Israel's border, expelled the UNEF force from Gaza and Sinai and took up UNEF positions at Sharm el-Sheikh overlooking the Straits of Tiran. Israel reiterated declarations made in 1957 that any closure of the straits would be considered an act of war or justification for war. Nasser declared the straits closed to Israeli shipping on May 22, 23. On May 30, Jordan and Egypt signed a defense pact. The following day, at Jordan's invitation, the Iraqi army began deploying troops and armored units in Jordan. They were later reinforced by an Egyptian contingent. On June 1, Israel formed a national unity government by widening its cabinet, and on June 4 the decision was made to go to war. The next morning, Israel launched Operation Focus, a large-scale surprise airstrike that launched the SixDay War. Events during the years before the war. Israel and the Arab states at the time. No Arab state had recognized Israel. Syria, aligned with the Soviet bloc, began sponsoring guerrilla raids on Israel in the early 1960s as part of its People's War of Liberation, designed to deflect domestic opposition to the Ba'ath Party. Speaking to the UN General Assembly in September 1960, Nasser had stated that the only solution to Palestine is that matters should return to the condition prevailing before the error was committed, i.e., the annulment of Israel's existence. Quote, in 1964 he said, "We swear to God that we shall not rest until we restore the Arab nation to Palestine and Palestine to the Arab nation. There is no room for imperialism and there is no room for Britain in our country, just as there is no room for Israel within the Arab nation." Quote, in 1965 he asserted, "We shall not enter Palestine with its soil covered in sand. We shall enter it with its soil saturated in blood." Even after nearly 2 decades of its existence, no neighboring Arab country of Israel was willing to negotiate a peace agreement with Israel or accept its existence. Tunisian President Habib Bourguiba suggested in a speech in Jericho in 1965 that the Arab world should face reality and negotiate with Israel, but this was rejected by the other Arab countries. Israel and Egypt. Suez Crisis aftermath. The Suez Crisis of 1956 represented a military defeat but a political victory for Egypt, and set the stage leading to the SixDay War. In a speech delivered to the Knesset, David Ben-Gurion said that the 1949 armistice agreement with Egypt was dead and buried, and that the armistice lines were no longer valid and could not be restored. Under no circumstances would Israel agree to the stationing of UN forces on its territory or in any area it occupied. Heavy diplomatic pressure from both the United States and the Soviet Union forced Israel into a conditional withdrawal of its military from the Sinai Peninsula. Only after satisfactory arrangements had been made with the international force that was about to enter the Canal Zone. After the 1956 war, Egypt agreed to the stationing of a UN peacekeeping force in the Sinai, the United Nations Emergency Force, to keep the border region demilitarized and prevent Palestinian Fedayeen guerrillas from crossing the border into Israel. As a result, the border between Egypt and Israel remained quiet for the vast majority of the period up to 1967. After the 1956 war, the region returned to an uneasy balance without resolution of any of the underlying issues. Israel and Egypt. Rotem crisis in February 1960. Tensions along the Israeli-Syrian border prompted Nasser to deploy Egyptian armed forces in northern Sinai. Only 6 days after troop movements had begun, did Israel learn of the presence of an Egyptian force, numbering around 500 tanks, on its undefended southern border. Caught off guard, Israel scrambled to deploy its own forces, while Ben-Gurion adopted a policy of pacification to ease tensions and prevent the outbreak of hostilities. Both sides eventually stood down, yet each drew different conclusions from the affair. Israeli national defense policy came to see any mass deployment of Egyptian forces on its border as unacceptable, and believed new rules had been set in place. Egypt, however, viewed the crisis as a great success. Egypt believed the deployment had prevented an Israeli attack on Syria, and it was thus possible to deter Israel with the mere deployment of forces, without the danger of going to war. The crisis was to have a direct effect on both sides during the events of May 1967, which eventually led to the Six-Day War. Both Israel and Egypt applied the lessons they had learned in the earlier affair. Indeed, these were at first perceived to be a repeat of the Rotem affair, and were expected to follow the same course. Major differences, however, gave the new crisis its own momentum and eventually led to war. Events during the months before the war. Israel and Jordan. Samu incident. The long armistice line between Jordan and Israel was tense since the beginning of Fatah's guerrilla operations in January 1965. While Syria supported such operations, Egypt and Jordan refused to let PLO guerrillas operate from the territory. After 1965, the majority of raids on Israel originated from the Syrian border. Israel viewed the state from which the raids were perpetrated as responsible. King Hussein, the Hashemite ruler, was in a bind. He did not want to appear as cooperating with Israel in light of the delicate relationship of his government with the majority Palestinian population in his kingdom, and his success in preventing such raids was only partial. In the summer and autumn of 1966, the PLO carried out several guerrilla attacks that caused death and injury to Israeli civilians and military personnel. This culminated on November 11, 1966, when an Israeli border patrol hit a landmine, killing 3 soldiers and injuring 6 others. Israel believed the mine had been planted by militants from Samu, a village in the southern West Bank, close to where the incident took place, which was a Fatah stronghold. This led the Israeli cabinet to approve a large-scale operation called Shredder. On Friday, November 12, King Hussein of Jordan penned a letter of personal condolence to Israel which he cabled to U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Walwath Barber, through the U.S. Embassy in Amman, which passed it to Barber in Tel Aviv. Barber, believing there was no urgency to delivering the letter, left it on his desk over the weekend, thus failing to deliver it in a timely fashion. The next day, on the morning of November 13, the Israel Defense Forces invaded Jordan, crossing the border into the West Bank and attacked Samu. The attacking force consisted of 3,000–4,000 soldiers backed by tanks and aircraft. They were divided into a reserve force, which remained on the Israeli side of the border, and 2 raiding parties which crossed into the West Bank. A larger force of 8 Centurion tanks, followed by 400 paratroopers mounted in 40 open-topped half-tracks and 60 engineers in 10 more half-tracks, headed for Samu, while a smaller force of 3 tanks and 100 paratroopers and engineers in 10 half-tracks headed towards 2 smaller villages, Khurbat El Markaz and Khurbat Jimba. According to Terence Britty's Eshkol, The Man and the Nation, 50 houses were destroyed, but the inhabitants had been evacuated hours before. To Israel's surprise, the Jordanian military intervened. The 48th Infantry Battalion of the Jordanian Army ran into the Israeli forces northwest of Samu, and 2 companies approaching from the northeast were intercepted by the Israelis, while a platoon of Jordanians armed with 2 106mm recoilless guns entered Samu. The Jordanian Air Force intervened as well, and a Jordanian Hunter fighter was shot down in the action. In the ensuing battles, 3 Jordanian civilians and 16 soldiers were killed, 54 other soldiers and 96 civilians were wounded. The commander of the Israeli paratroop battalion, Colonel Yoav Shavim, was killed and 10 other Israeli soldiers were wounded. According to the Israeli government, 50 Jordanians were killed, but the true number was never disclosed by the Jordanians. In order to keep up morale and confidence in King Hussein's regime, the whole battle was short. The Israeli forces crossed the ceasefire line at 6 a.m. and returned by 10 o'clock a.m. Samu incident consequences. Hussein felt betrayed by the operation, which shattered the fragile trust between Israel and Jordan. He had been having secret meetings with Israeli foreign ministers Abdel and Golda Meir for 3 years. According to him, he was doing everything he could to stop guerrilla attacks from the West Bank and Jordan. I told them I could not absorb a serious retaliatory raid, and they accepted the logic of this and promised there would never be one. 2 days later, in a memo to U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson, his special assistant Walt Roster wrote, "Retaliation is not the point in this case. This 3,000-man raid with tanks and planes was out of all proportion to the provocation and was aimed at the wrong target," and went on to describe the damage done to U.S. and Israeli interests. "They've wrecked a good system of tacit cooperation between Hussein and the Israelis. They've undercut Hussein. We've spent $500 million to shore him up as a stabilizing factor on Israel's longest border and vis-a-vis Syria and Iraq. Israel's attack increases the pressure on him to counterattack not only from the more radical Arab governments and from the Palestinians in Jordan, but also from the army, which is his main source of support and may now press for a chance to recoup its Sunday losses. They've set back progress toward a long-term accommodation with the Arabs. They may have persuaded the Syrians that Israel didn't dare attack Soviet-protected Syria but could attack US-backed Jordan with impunity." The United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 228 unanimously deploring the loss of life and heavy damage to property resulting from the action of the government of Israel on 13 November 1966, censuring Israel for conducting a large-scale and carefully planned military action against Jordanian territory in violation of the United Nations Charter and of the General Armistice Agreement between Israel and Jordan, and emphasizing to Israel that actions of military reprisal cannot be tolerated and that, if they are repeated, the Security Council will have to consider further and more effective steps as envisaged in the Charter to ensure against the repetition of such acts. Facing a storm of criticism from Jordanians, Palestinians, and his Arab neighbors for failing to protect Samu, Hussein ordered a nationwide mobilization on November 20. Hussein complained that Egypt and Syria had failed to protect the West Bank, while hiding behind UNEF skirts. This accusation may have been a factor in Nasser's decision to rid his country of the UNEF force on the eve of the Six-Day War. This was the largest-scale operation that Israel had been involved with since the Suez crisis, while the diplomatic and political developments were not as Israel expected. Following the operation, Hussein worked hard to avoid any further clashes by preventing guerrilla operations from being launched from within Jordan. Some view the Samu attack as the beginning of the escalation in tensions that led to the war, with others going further to describe it as the first step in the prelude to war. Israel and Syria. Overall, Orn's account of the period portrays Israel as the innocent victim of Syrian provocation and aggression. For the Golan Heights, Syrians had shelled Israeli settlements and other targets, such as fishermen in the Sea of Galilee. drawing punitive responsive strikes from Israel. In addition, following the 1966 coup in Damascus, attacks and acts of sabotage by Syrian-based Palestinian guerrillas had increased, although Jordan was still the main source. For 2.5 years from the start of the attacks up until the Israeli invasion of Syria on April 7, 1967, the Fatah incursions launched from Syrian territory had resulted in 3 Israeli deaths, all of them soldiers. In September 1966, the Israeli Chief of Staff Yitzhak Rabin gave an interview in which he stated that Israeli actions should be aimed at those who carry out the attacks and at the regime that supports them. These unfortunate words were interpreted as a plot to bring down the Syrian government. Syria also claimed that Syrian shelling had always occurred in response to Israeli firing on peaceful Arab farmers of Syrian posts. This point, also raised by Dan in his interview, is further supported by the eyewitness accounts of Dutch UN Observer Force Colonel Jan Muren, who attested to the Israeli practice of using armored tractors to farm in the DMZ in areas prohibited by the 1949 Armistice Agreement. These activities would draw Syrian fire, to which Israel would respond with its own forces. However, the vague 1949 Armistice Agreement had not prohibited civil activity in the DMZ. In November 1966, Egypt and Syria signed a defense pact whereby each country would support the other if it were attacked. According to Indarjit Rikai, Egyptian Foreign Minister Mahmoud Riyad told him that the Soviet Union had persuaded Egypt to enter the pact with 2 ideas in mind: to reduce the chances of a punitive attack on Syria by Israel, and to bring the Syrians under Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser's moderating influence. At the end of December 1966, the IDF renewed its buffer fire in the demilitarized zones, after a 6-month lull due to the unconditional ceasefire initiated by the Syrians. In January 1967, the Israeli Minister of Health, Yisrael Barzilai, warned that Egypt's commitment to Syria under the Mutual Defense Pact could escalate the situation and nobody foresee how it will end. During a visit to London in February 1967, Israeli Foreign Minister Abdel briefed journalists on Israel's hopes and anxieties, explaining to those present that, although the governments of Lebanon, Jordan and the United Arab Republic seem to have decided against active confrontation with Israel, it remained to be seen whether Syria could maintain a minimal level of restraint at which hostility was confined to rhetoric. At the same time, Israel was planning, approving and executing the provocations of Syria along the DMZ referred to by Dan. The provocations were sending a tractor to plow in the demilitarized areas. The Syrians would fire on these tractors and would frequently shell Israeli settlements. This reached a critical point when armored tractor work on land in the southern demilitarized zone close to Kibbutz Haron was scheduled. It was anticipated that the Syrians would react. The Israeli Air Force was placed on alert. Prime Minister Eshkol approved the plan. April 7, 1967 cross-border battle. Earlier in the week, Syria had twice attacked an Israeli tractor working in the DMZ area. When the tractor returned on the morning of April 7, 1967, as predicted in the plan, the Syrians opened fire again, initially with light weapons. The Israelis responded by sending in armor-plated tractors to continue plowing, resulting in further exchanges of fire. The resulting tit-for-tat escalated, leading to tanks, heavy mortars, machine guns, and artillery being used in various sections along the 47-mile border in what was described as a dispute over cultivation rights in the demilitarized zone southeast of Lake Tiberias. At this point the critical departure from previous incidents occurred, without advance planning nor having been submitted for prior approval to the Ministerial Committee on Security. Israeli aircraft dive-bombed Syrian positions with 250 and 500 kilograms bombs. For the first time the IF was employed before an Israeli settlement had actually been shelled and Israeli planes penetrated as far as Damascus. The Syrians then responded by shelling Israeli border settlements heavily, and Israeli jets retaliated by bombing the village of Skufiyya, destroying around 40 houses in the process. At 15:19 Syrian shells started falling on kibbutz Gadot. Over 300 landed within the kibbutz compound in 40 minutes. The incident had escalated into a full-scale aerial battle over the Golan Heights after Israel scrambled jets, resulting in the loss of 6 Syrian Air Force MiG-21s to Israeli Air Force Dassault Mirage IIs, and the latter's flight over Damascus. The United Nations Truce Supervision Organization attempted to arrange a ceasefire, but Syria declined to cooperate unless Israeli agricultural work was halted. The Israeli newspaper Maariv wrote, "This was not an incident but a real war." Quote, "Under these circumstances, the Soviet Union intervened to halt the downward course of events and to deter Israel by activating the Egyptian-Syrian Defense Pact signed in November 1966 under Soviet pressure for this precise purpose." Although the April 7 cross-border battle is often called an incident, various reactions to the event belie this description. The Israeli press called it a war. Moshe Dayan was reported by Isa Weissman to have responded, "Have you lost your minds? You are leading the country to war." Quote, Brigadier General Israel Leo agreed, "From my point of view, the Six-Day War had begun on April 21, 1967 as in May 1966. The Soviet Deputy Foreign Minister, Yakov Malik, relayed an oral message to the Israeli ambassador in Moscow. The government of the Soviet Union seized the need to warn again the government of Israel that the hazardous policy it has been waging for several years is fraught with danger, and will be held solely responsible." Later developments. Speaking to a Mapai Party meeting in Jerusalem on May 11, Prime Minister of Israel Levi Eshkol warned that Israel would not hesitate to use air power on the scale of the 7th of April in response to continued border terrorism. And on the same day Israeli envoy Gideon Raphael presented a letter to the President of the Security Council warning that Israel would act in self-defense as circumstances warrant. Writing from Tel Aviv on May 12, James Ferron reported that some Israeli leaders had decided to use force against Syria of considerable strength but of short duration and limited in area, and quoted one qualified observer who said it was highly unlikely that Egypt, Syria's closest ally in the Arab world, would enter the hostilities unless the Israeli attack were extensive. In early May the Israeli cabinet authorized a limited strike against Syria, but Rabin's renewed demand for a large-scale strike to discredit or topple the Ba'ath regime was opposed by Eshkol. BBC journalist Jeremy Bowen reports, the toughest threat was reported by the news agency United Press International on the 12th of May. A high Israeli source said today that Israel would take limited military action designed to topple the Damascus army regime if Syrian terrorists continue sabotage raids inside Israel. Military observers said such an offensive would fall short of all-out war but would be mounted to deliver a telling blow against the Syrian government. In the West as well as the Arab world, the immediate assumption was that the unnamed source was Rabin and that he was serious. In fact, it was Brigadier General Aharon Yarov, the head of military intelligence, and the story was overwritten. Yarov mentioned an all-out invasion of Syria and conquest of Damascus, but only as the most extreme of a range of possibilities. But the damage had been done. Tension was so high that most people, and not just the Arabs, assumed that something much bigger than usual was being planned against Syria. Border incidents multiplied and numerous Arab leaders, both political and military, called for an end to Israeli attacks. Egypt, then already trying to seize a central position in the Arab world under Nasser, accompanied these declarations with plans to remilitarize the Sinai. Syria shared these views, although it did not prepare for an immediate invasion. The Soviet Union actively backed the military needs of the Arab states. Israel and Egypt in April 1967, after meeting with Nasser. SixDay Battle, the U.S. ambassador in Egypt, reported to Washington that Nasser plans to deflect mounting internal pressure against his regime by creating a foreign policy crisis which could be to heat up the Israeli situation.